In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a medium-sized men's shirt and turn it into a woman's top with a Peter Pan collar, using this as my inspiration. For this refashion, you'll need some paper for a pattern and some 1/4 inch elastic for the sleeves, along with the usual sewing supplies. I found out the hard way that elastic can shrink when you wash it, so it's a good idea to wash and dry it before sewing. I simply secured this one with a rubber band so it wouldn't get tangled and tossed it in the laundry. I also used some extra fabric, this is from an old sheet, as an interfacing to give the collar a bit more structure, but this is optional. So let's get started. First, we're going to create a simple pattern for the collar. Cut the collar around the base of the stand to remove it from the body of the shirt. I recommend cutting the placket about 1 inch from the top of the button, which will give you enough room to attach the binding, but is close enough to the button so that the shirt will close properly. Draw a curved line from the placket to where you want the neckline to meet the neckline of the shirt in the back. If you don't want to draw it freehand, you can use a bowl or other round object. Fold the shirt in half by aligning the button plackets, then cut along the marked line. To make the pattern, fold the shirt in half with the button plackets aligned. Pin into place and make sure it's nice and flat. Slip a piece of paper under the neckline, making sure to leave room for the collar and 1/2 inch for seam allowance. Trace along the neckline and along the edges of the shoulder and button plackets. I made a mistake here and ended up having to add fabric to the back of the collar because I didn't realize that the neckline fabric was bunched up when I laid it out, so my measurements were off. To avoid this, measure the shirt's neckline with a measuring tape and make sure that the measurement equals the length of the pattern's neckline, and adjust the pattern if necessary. Label the pattern so the front and the back don't get mixed up. Remove 1 inch from the front to compensate for the button placket because the collar should start on either side of the placket. Draw the width of the collar by marking the distance from the neckline. I made mine 2 inches wide. Connect the marks to delineate the bottom of the collar. Draw the angle of the collar in the front and round the corners. I had to play with it a little, but then came up with something I thought would work. Add 1/2 inch of seam allowance all the way around the pattern. Then cut out the pattern. And the final should look something like this. Next, we're going to cut the sleeves. Fold the shirt in half and mark how long you want the sleeve to be, then add about 1 inch extra for the hem and the gathers. For me, that was about 8.5 inches from the shoulder. Cut off the sleeves parallel to the cuffs. Remove the cuffs and open the seams so the sleeves can lay flat. I also ironed them to make it easier to cut out the pattern pieces. Stack the 2 sleeves on top of each other with the button plackets aligned. Cut 4 pattern pieces, 2 for the front and 2 for the back of the collar, from the sleeves. Because I'm working with a plaid, I lined up the patterns carefully because it's very noticeable when plaids are off in the front of the shirt. To calculate the length of the seam bindings, measure the length of the neckline, including the button plackets, and add at least 1 inch extra for seam allowance. Cut the seam bindings from the bottom of the shirt. I cut mine 4 inches from the bottom of the back of the shirt. I made 2 strips, 1.5 inches wide and 13 inches long, approximately, And I ended up trimming the width later, so you could probably make yours a little narrower, like 1.25 inches or even 1 inch wide. But since I don't always know exactly how things will work out, I tend to give myself extra. Finally, I cut the interfacing from my fabric scrap using the collar pattern. If I were to do this again, I would use the interfacing as a test to see if the collar is the right size, and then cut the shirt fabric afterwards. Actually, I think the contrasting collar looks kind of cute, but for these videos, I like to challenge myself to use as much of the original shirt as possible. The next step is to piece the various sections of the collar together. Sew the two halves of the top of the collar together with the right sides facing, and back tack at the beginning and end. Repeat the process with the undersides of the collar, the two sides of the facing, and with the seam bindings. Then iron all the seams open. To sew the collar, stack the 3 layers on top of each other. Start with the 2 collar sections with the right sides facing each other. Then add the interfacing. Pin the layers together so they don't shift around. Sew the 3 layers together along the sides and back, leaving the neckline open. Start at the front, go around the curve, and all the way to the other side, back tacking at the beginning and the end. Trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch or so. To avoid puckering, snip around the curves of the collar, getting as close to the seam as possible without cutting it. Turn the collar inside out and push out the curves. If the edges are jagged or if the fabric puckers, add more snips. Carefully iron the collar. Then top stitch along the edges of the collar, staying as close to the fold as possible. This step is optional, but it helps keep the collar flat. To attach the collar to the shirt, align the back seam of the collar with the center back of the shirt and pin into place with the underside of the collar facing the right side of the shirt. Pin the rest of the collar into place. Ideally, the ends of the collar will be on either side of the button placket. Sew the collar to the neckline and back tack at the beginning and end. To attach the binding, pin the center of the binding to the center of the collar in the back with the right sides facing each other. Pin all the way around the shirt until you get to the plackets. Sew the binding to the shirt from one placket to the other, back tacking at the beginning and end of the seam. Trim all the seam allowances together, being careful not to accidentally cut the seam binding underneath. Clip the curves of the seam allowances to make sure the collar can move freely. Trim the ends of the binding about 1/2 inch from the placket. Fold the seam binding away from the collar and under stitch, that is, sew a row of stitches close to the fold to attach the binding to the seam allowances. Fold the binding over the seam allowances. If the binding is too wide, like mine, you can trim it first. Just make sure you have enough to cover the raw edges of the seam. Fold the ends to cover the raw edges near the plackets. Then fold the seam binding over the edges of the seam allowances. Fold the bound seam down and pin into place all the way around the collar. Top stitch the binding from the inside, starting at the button placket. Back tack at the beginning of the seam, sew all the way around to the second placket, and back tack again. And this is what the collar looks like from the inside of the shirt. To hem the sleeves, turn the shirt inside out, turn up the raw edge 1/4 inch or so, and iron into place. Turn the folded edge up, iron again, and pin into place. starting at the side seam, sew close to the fold all the way around the hem. Once you reach the starting point, sew over the existing stitches and back tack. Next, we're going to create a ruffle by sewing a strip of elastic to the inside of the sleeve. Measure the elastic by wrapping it around your arm. Add 2 inches for seam allowance and cut. Overlap the ends by 1 inch and sew into place using a medium width zigzag stitch. Pinning the elastic first can help maneuver the elastic under the presser foot. Once the presser foot is down, you can remove the pin and sew. Back tack at the beginning and end. Fold the elastic in half and mark the 2 halves with pins. Repeat with the sleeves, marking at the underarm seam and at the shoulder fold. Place the elastic a 1/4 inch or so from the hem, depending on how long you want the ruffle to be. Line up the pins on the elastic and the sleeve and pin them together. And then repeat on the other side of the sleeve. Starting near the underarm seam, lower the presser foot onto the elastic. Anchor it by lowering the needle, then stretch the elastic until the fabric is flat by holding the 2 places where the fabric and elastic are pinned together. Using a medium width zigzag stitch, sew from one pin to the next, then repeat the procedure and sew the second half of the sleeve. When you reach the beginning of the seam, sew over the stitches and back tack to secure and repeat with the other sleeve. To hem the shirt, start at the placket on the wrong side of the shirt and turn up the raw edge a 1/4 inch or so and iron into place. Continue ironing around the hem to the second placket. Turn the folded edge up again, iron again, and pin into place. Starting at the placket, sew close to the fold, back tack, then sew all the way around the hem to the second placket and back tack again. And that's it, we're done. And here's the result. First, I wanted to show you what the finished shirt looks like up close. The collar with the fabric interfacing has some structure but isn't as stiff as iron-on interfacing, so I like the way it turned out. And here's what the sleeves with the elastic look like. Sometimes changing a detail like the collar or the sleeves can transform a men's shirt into something more feminine. You can, of course, wear men's shirts unaltered, and I do, but I'll be much more likely to wear this particular shirt the way it looks now. So I hope it inspires you to try your own refashioning project. Thanks for watching, and happy upcycling!